Hi, Todd.
Hello,
How are you doing?
I'm well. How are you?
Good, good, very well. Thanks for taking the debate. We're just having a look at the LinkedIn comments that started it all and how we got here, but I appreciate you taking it.
Okay.
So, do you want to start by each of us giving a bit of an introduction? I saw you shared on LinkedIn. I think that some of your people are watching might not know who I am, and some of my people are watching might not know much about you. So we both can give a bit of background, and then we'll get into it.
Yeah, if you want to go first, that's fine.
Sure thing. Yeah. So I'm Chris Bryant. I am a researcher. I have my PhD. I started a think tank about 6 years ago. I've published few dozen peer-reviewed papers at this point, including things about health impacts of plant-based meat vis-a-vis conventional meat. And I'll just briefly say, person to this debate, we have done a bit of back and forth on a few studies that I posted, or I guess one particular study that I posted about the association between high IQ in childhood and increased likelihood of vegetarianism as an adult. And that's led us to come and debate the cognitive and overall health associations of veganism and omnivorous diets.
Yep. Good. So for the benefit of your audience, my name is Todd Thurman. I'm the founder of Swine Insights International, which is a consultancy that provides consulting and training services to global pork producers. About 80, we're based here in the US, but about 80% of our business is international. A lot of that is in Asia, so probably 3/4 of that 80% is in Asia, with a heavy presence in China, but also in Southeast Asia. We also have clients in Latin America, and obviously in North America. We still do a little bit in Europe. And then we have a few new projects we're working to expand into Africa. I have a degree in animal science, a bachelor's degree in animal science. My background is almost entirely in production animal agriculture. In terms of research, I have done some basic research. When I was in college, I worked at the research farm. So we did some basic research there, but most of my research has been field research. And really, I'm primarily a consumer of research. It's one of my responsibilities as a consultant to stay up to date on the emerging research in my field and make sure that my clients are aware of what's going on and what's changing and what new information is available. So I spend a lot of time reading research papers, probably 150 papers a year. AI has been really nice to help manage that workload, but there's no substitution for reading them yourself. So I've found that AI is pretty useful in terms of filtering those papers, but I've not been confident enough to turn it over reading the papers and interpreting the results to AI yet. So this topic is, I guess, tangentially related to my field, but not directly. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a nutritionist. I'm not a dietitian. I think I'm fairly well read in the field, especially as it relates to meat consumption, as obviously that has an impact on my business. But I'm certainly not putting myself out there as an expert, and I definitely won't be, making personalized recommendations about what people should or shouldn't eat. So I'm going to try to keep it as general as possible. It probably is obvious, but I will state that obviously I'm biased on this topic. I'm definitely biased in favor of inclusion in meat in the diet for a variety of reasons, but obviously I make my living in the animal agriculture business, so it would be kind of foolish to deny that I have a bias. I don't necessarily think that's a huge problem as long as people are aware of it and that I'm aware of it. I think everybody is biased to some degree, some more than others. And it is kind of interesting that when you're closer to a topic, you tend to develop strong opinions about that. And so I think that's, what's important there. I think it's just being upfront and honest about that. And I certainly am. And I assume you would also agree that at least some degree you're biased as well, probably on the other side. But I do think it's important to call that out.
Yeah. Okay. Nice. Thank you for the intro. And yes, that is a fair comment. Yeah, my consultancy works with mainly animal protection nonprofits. So we've done a little bit of stuff with alternative proteins, and that seems to be the conflict of interest that people tend to be most animated about. That you're paid by big meat alternatives. We're really not, to a very large extent at all. Most of what we do is with animal charities, which is, its own has its own set of interests as well on this topic. It's a little bit of different character in the sense that, yeah, I am pretty much, I'm self-employed, and so as are you, and so through my consultancy working with the non-profits, I'm paying myself less than minimum wage in doing that. So although it is paying me, it's not, I'd be making more money doing pretty much anything else, but certainly, yeah, worth flagging. We each have our biases going into this conversation. And you mentioned that you read a lot of research for your role as a consultant. I assume that's mainly about agricultural production and farming methods, and not so much in health and nutrition. Is that fair to say?
Yes. So really in every aspect related to production. So we have a geneticist on our team that will handle, the real deep genetic stuff, but I'm definitely reading those studies as well. We do have an animal nutritionist on our team as well. And he'll obviously take the lead on those nutrition papers, but I'm taking the lead on reproductive physiology, other physiology issues. We do have a consulting veterinarian that handles some of the health stuff. So I'm really a general read over all of the basically animal production field, and then I'll collaborate with my colleagues who are specialists in particular areas. If I see something I think is interesting, or I don't understand, or I want to understand better, then obviously I'll toss that over to them. And very often they've already, by the time I get to it, they've already reviewed it, and we'll have a discussion about it. But yeah, it's generally related to production. I mean, obviously that's where I make my living, so that's where I spend the majority of my time. But I do do some crossover and other issues. Interestingly, I also, in the last 5 or 6 years, like a lot of people during COVID, I did some things that were unusual for me. Took some projects that I probably wouldn't have taken otherwise because we were stuck at home. And for someone that travels, 180 to 200 nights a year, that's a big change of pace. And so I took a couple of projects that. And one of those projects had me looking at long-term food demand for China. And so I got into, really took me down a rabbit hole of looking at some demographic trends. And so I've been doing quite a bit of research around demographics and how that's going to impact food demand. And so that's taken me into the realm of the social sciences, which has been quite an adjustment for me. I mean, most of what we do on the animal side is pretty well controlled. So most of those studies are, would be classified as, RCTs.
Oh no, is that my side?
Was a new thing for me. So, and I was, in some cases kind of surprised at what passes for, compelling evidence in the social sciences. So, it's definitely been an education for me. My dad is a chemist and my mom's a social worker. So I have had to eat some crow in making fun of the social sciences and having to go back to my mom and ask for some advice on how to think through some of these issues and interpret some of this data. So that's been an interesting side for me that has definitely kind of changed my perspective on research, and certainly in this sort of crossover area where a lot of the research is observational compared to what I'm more accustomed to.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, and we can talk about the observational research and stuff like that. But yeah, so maybe a lot of your exposure to research in animal sciences, and then also on production, but you don't have any particular expertise or credentials in like health and nutrition overall, right? Well, that's
Correct.
like yeah, okay, yeah, that's fine. That's good to, and that doesn't, of course, mean that you're wrong, but it's just good to be like where we're coming from, right? Okay, well, so my case that I was posting on LinkedIn that you had responded to, in particular, there was a study about higher IQ in childhood leading to increased likelihood of vegetarianism in adulthood. And then there was a couple of other associative studies showing higher cognitive function associated with lower consumption of meat, in particular red meat. And I think this upset a few people. And in particular, I think that it's kind of a fair comment that those studies were not particularly strong evidence for that case. And certainly for a causal case, my thinking when I was posting that at the time was that it's not that being vegetarian or vegan leads to increased intelligence, but rather the other way around, such that people who are smarter are more likely to become vegetarian or vegan. And that's kind of what you see with the childhood IQ and adulthood vegetarianism, right? So I was very much thinking about this as the other way around. But that said, since then, and partly in preparation for this debate, I've been looking at broader evidence on that topic, and actually there is quite a lot of evidence suggesting that plant-based diets can be protective against cognitive decline and dementia, particularly in older age. And there's a good number of studies showing that association. I have notes on a bunch of meta-analyses that we can talk through here, but just, do you have any thoughts on that? Like, I've kind of somewhat, well, I guess I've got stronger in the belief since we spoke about it.
Yeah, so I think those studies that I reviewed, the one in particular that you mentioned on LinkedIn, I mean, it's certainly interesting, but it's interesting to me more from a psychological or sociological perspective. There's a couple of things that I think are interesting here to call out. One is I think you're right. I mean, if anything, if that serves as compelling evidence for anything, it's that maybe children with higher IQ might be more likely to become vegans or vegetarians as adults, at least at one point. When they were evaluated at, I think, something around 30 years old or something like that. I mean, that's interesting. I don't see that as compelling evidence at all. It seems overall fairly weak evidence of just about anything, but I don't see it as particularly compelling evidence that there's somehow some link between a vegan or vegetarian diet and higher IQ, especially since the higher IQ preceded the diet. It wasn't clear to me. It didn't seem like there was any records of whether those adults were vegan or vegetarian as children. They just were vegetarian as adults. And so, yeah, I mean, it's somewhat interesting. It just seems like really weak data. People on my side of the argument would take what I would consider to be similar quality data to make an argument that somehow meat is protective of mental health. There are some studies out there to show a correlation between vegetarianism or veganism, and higher incidence of depression, anxiety, some of those mental health challenges. For a lot of the same reasons, I don't really feel like that that data is very compelling. I think when I look at that, I think what you're seeing is a correlation between the types of people that would be predisposed to those mental health challenges anyway, and people that would be predisposed to choosing a vegan or vegetarian diet. And to me, that's probably, again, more of a sociological or psychological connection, which you would obviously be more qualified than I to speak to, than it is some sort of biological connection. When we try to look at the biological connection between cognitive function, things like dementia, and mental health, to me, the evidence, at least as it stands right now, is pretty weak and not particularly compelling. And I just would not feel comfortable drawing any significant conclusions from what's out there right now.
Interesting. Okay, so there's a few things there. So we accept that there's the connection between higher IQ and vegetarianism. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that. I mean, I certainly wouldn't be willing to admit that that there's any evidence that the vegetarianism caused the high IQ. If anything, it's the other way around. I'm not particularly convinced by that link either. I mean, obviously there's a link there, but whether that's causal or not, I don't find that. It's certainly possible, I suppose, but I don't find that compelling.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a reasonable position on that point. Certainly on that evidence that I posted, so there is a link between higher vegetarianism or higher IQ and increased rates of vegetarianism. And yeah, I don't think that either of us is saying that the vegetarianism is causal of the high IQ in that case. And I agree with you, it's probably more likely the other way around, such that smarter people are more likely to go vegetarian.
Well, I would challenge a little bit on your leap from higher childhood IQ to smarter. I mean, there's several different ways to measure intelligence, and IQ is only one of them. I do think it's a useful metric, but it's certainly not the only thing. There are other types of intelligence that are quite useful and that aren't fully captured, and certainly there's some controversy around the accuracy and usability of IQ. I'm not suggesting that I'm someone that is real anti-IQ. I do think it's a useful measure, but I do think you have to be a little bit careful to take the leap that it's, the term smarter and the term higher and the higher IQ, I don't think is necessarily a fair leap.
Well, I'm aware there are some criticisms of IQ as a measure, but I think it is pretty well correlated. First of all, it's well correlated with a bunch of other measures of intelligence. They'll be kind of calibrated slightly differently, but I don't think there are any measures of intelligence that are going to be inversely correlated with measures of IQ, for example. There might be kind of emphasis in different places or something like that. But moreover, IQ is correlated with a bunch of other things that we might care about in terms of life outcomes, and future income is going to be a big one. Just ability to navigate the world. There's all sorts of benefits and advantages of having a high IQ. For me, I think it maps on pretty well to what we mean when we kind of say colloquially smart, clever, intelligent people. I think it maps on pretty well, and it maps on pretty well to other measures of intelligence as I understand it as well.
Well, and some of those correlations with life outcome, I mean, you're talking about, what degree are you talking about? I mean, at some point, yes, you get below a certain level of intelligence, and that can be a real hindrance towards life success. But you get to a certain level, and it's been a while since I've reviewed this research, but I did fall down a rabbit hole one time a few years ago about IQ and how it correlates with life success. And you get to a certain point, and there doesn't seem to be a particularly big advantage. And so if you go back and look, and if we're going to say, okay, there's a correlation between higher IQ and diet, whether that's positive or negative for veganism, it matters quite a bit whether, where you're at in that scale, right? Are you going up, an incremental amount in the middle of that scale where it doesn't necessarily correlate too much to, quote unquote, success or life results, or are you talking about a significantly lower percentage of people that would be below that, sort of minimum threshold for, life success. So again, it's been a while since I've reviewed that, and I'm not sure if I remember what the actual IQ numbers we were looking at on that study were, but that's definitely something to consider.
Yeah, I mean, there will be definitely threshold considerations where it's like, like say, like very low IQ is going to be some outcomes are going to be like kind of binary 1 or 0, like has a degree or doesn't have a degree, for example. So there's going to be some thresholds where like that's kind of comes online. But overall, IQ's pretty well established, correlate with educational attainment, occupation status, income, longevity, even like higher IQ people tend to live longer. And I think that goes to the point about vegetarianism and why I think that this kind of direction of causation is something for people to think about, because, as I say, originally I was not really at all thinking of this in terms of like a plant-based diet will increase your intelligence, but rather more intelligent people are more likely to choose a plant-based diet. And I think that is something where, for me, if I were to find that out about some other ideology or lifestyle or set of beliefs, that would give me pause for thought to think, okay, well, maybe these people have a point here. I've made the point before about, I don't believe in flat Earth, but if I saw a study that said people who believe in flat Earth tend to have higher IQs, for me, I would think, that's interesting. I should give that flat Earth stuff another look, right? Likewise, if I see something that's like, climate skeptics tend to have lower IQ. I'm not saying either of these are the case, but climate skeptics tend to have lower IQs. Well, then I would probably think I probably don't need to bother looking too far into that, right? Now, of course, it's not going to be determinative. It would be kind of surprising about the kind of trueness of a position, but yeah, I think for me, discovering that people with higher IQs more likely to be vegetarian or vegan would certainly be a cause to think maybe they have a point, right?
It could be. I think one of the things that you mentioned there with the two examples you gave would be, more ideological beliefs, though. So, is the higher likelihood of adopting a vegan or vegetarian diet, does it have anything to do with biology or with nutrition, or is it that that social decision to become a vegan or a vegetarian? I mean, I'm sure you're more than aware that there are some social implications of choosing a diet that is not standard, right? Whether that's a vegan diet or a carnivore diet, for that matter. And so I think there's potentially a predisposition amongst people of a higher IQ to adopt, a non-standard practice, right? A non-standard lifestyle. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, but that seems equally as likely, at least to me, as there's somehow, smart people choose to be vegan because it's healthier. Well, I think the general trend in mainstream media, mainstream science has been pretty anti-meat over the last several years. And so, I think if you go back and look at intellectuals that were children in the 40s, I would imagine they were probably far more likely to become part of that 1960s counterculture movement, the anti-war movement. I'm almost certain that would be the case. I don't know if there's any research to back that up, but so that's really more of an alignment with a social cause, and that's certainly true for what we would maybe call, I don't know what you would call it, but maybe ethical vegans that were choosing this lifestyle, not necessarily for the nutritional benefits, but for other reasons. So I think that's definitely something to consider. And if we go back and look at that, IQ does have an impact on some of those things. And then really one of the things that we have to talk about is just the healthy user bias here, that when any time that you're comparing, almost all the time, when you're comparing say a vegan diet or even a vegetarian diet to quote unquote meat eater or an omnivore, that group of people is pre-selected, right? And there are some things that we can do, statistically to manipulate that data to try to correct to some degree for some of those variables, but those procedures are imperfect and imprecise, and it's almost impossible to even define all of the variables that come into play there, and much less correct for them, and without the ability to do a randomized control trial to any meaningful sense, I think it just speaks to me, it speaks to the difficulty of doing research on human nutrition. It's just extraordinarily challenging. And I look at some of these studies, and sometimes I may have some methodological critiques or whatever, but I think the biggest takeaway is this: it's just really hard to generate any data there that is compelling, because of for a variety of reasons, but this healthy user bias I think is a huge one. People that choose a restrictive diet like that are much more likely to be adherent to other healthy activities. They're less likely to smoke, they're less likely to drink, some of these other things, and it's just very difficult to correct for some of those things. And then I think the other issue there is you start reading some of the results and the conclusions from some of these studies, and you're like, well, that's a much softer statement than what the people are out there on social media sharing, and a lot of times it's this correlation between higher intake of plant source foods is associated with X, Y, or Z benefit. Well, that doesn't necessarily mean that a meat eater couldn't capture those benefits as well by eating more plant-based foods, right? And so I think one of the things that we have to think about here is, a lot of times the question is asked, I get asked this question all the time: should people eat less meat? Well, it depends on what they're going to replace it with. Should people eat less meat if they're going to replace it with green leafy fruits, green leafy vegetables, and low sugar fruits? Then almost certainly, probably most people in the developed world should. But if they're going to replace it with carbs and sugar and sweetened drinks and things of that nature, then probably they're better off keeping their meat intake where it's at, or even increasing it. So I think that's one of the main problems as I look at this. It's just extraordinarily difficult, and that leaves open huge opportunities for people with ideological biases or whatever to come in and interpret the data and go way beyond what the data really says. And it's extraordinarily difficult, I think, even for scientists trying to evaluate that data, and it's almost impossible for the general public to evaluate that. And so I think that's why you end up in this situation where we're at. I mean, I mean, you and I are having a debate about whether a diet that includes meat or doesn't include meat is healthier or better for you cognitively. I'm sure there are similar conversations going on all over the world right now. You know, what's not going on around the world is two scientists arguing about whether mixing two compounds is going to result in an exothermic reaction, right? They've done the studies. They know, you know, these are, you know, this is, you know, no science is settled in the sense that it's all the results are, you know, open to change just by the basic nature of science. But I mean, these are not things that people argue about because they're so well established that it's difficult to argue with. You know, the studies have been done. If you don't believe the studies, go do it yourself, and you're going to find that that's very much indeed exothermic reaction. So, you know, I think there are fields where it is much more difficult to draw broad conclusions for a variety of reasons. And in a lot of ways, human nutrition is like the perfect storm of all of those problems. It's very difficult to do randomized control trials. There is a lot of ideological bias. There's a lot of emotion behind these issues, arguably more emotion behind some of these issues than almost any other that we debate about in public. You know, and you know, we're relying on mostly observational data, which is not, you know, it's not, there's no value there at all. It's just that you very often end up with an inability to determine causation. I mean, by definition, really, you can't determine causation. And I think the other factor that comes into play here is that the impacts are pretty small, right? You know, so if you're seeing a very large effect and you have a large amount of epidemiological data to support that, you can come to some pretty strong conclusions. But very often, in my experience, very often the effects are quite small, especially on an absolute basis. And so if you think about some of those things, there's a lot of opportunity for ideological bias. It's very difficult to do randomized controlled trials. There's you know, the effects tend to be relatively small. It makes it extraordinarily difficult to draw any strong conclusions. And so I think, you know, most of what I see out there is, from my perspective, hyperbolic. It's overstating what the evidence supports.
Okay, well, there's a lot there, so we can go through it point by point. So yeah, there's a couple of things that you've said that I think are reasonable concessions on your part. I appreciate that, saying that probably if you're replacing it with healthy plant foods, then most people in developed countries should be eating less meat, which obviously I agree, and didn't really expect to hear that from you, honestly, so, you know, that's good. I think to go all the way back to the point about the correlation with IQ, you said that mainstream science has tended to be anti-meat, which I agree with that. I think that's because that is what the scientific evidence tends to support. And in terms of like people, perhaps smarter people are more likely to take kind of unconventional or countercultural positions. I think that's probably true to the extent that those positions are reasonable and that like mainstream behavior doesn't align with mainstream science, for example with eating red meat. I think that, you know, smart people are going to be more able to look at the scientific evidence and say, okay, there's actually pretty strong evidence that this is correlated with worse health outcomes and with other considerations that you might have, like environmental outcomes or animal suffering and things like this, and therefore I'm going to align with that. But I don't think, as far as I'm aware, there's any evidence of higher IQ amongst people following a carnivore diet, for example, which is going to be another like countercultural kind of minority position. I don't think that there's any research on the topic, but from what I've seen anecdotally, I would say maybe the opposite is the case there. So if it was purely a function of like taking some sort of countercultural position, I think you would expect to see the same thing with respect to other minority diets. For example, carnivore. I don't think that you do see that.
Well, we just don't have there's very little data at all on the carnivore diet, and frankly, there's not a lot of data on the vegan diet, to be honest. But there's almost zero on the carnivore, and I'm not here to defend the carnivore diet. I think both the vegan diet and the carnivore diet are extreme diets by definition. They exclude entire food groups. So I would advocate for most people for something in the middle, but. Is there a correlation between some of the things that we see on the vegan diet and the carnivore diet? I don't know. I would be interested in seeing that data, but I don't think there's very little out there on it. And another thing that
it'd be interesting.
We have to think about is
I'd certainly also be interested to see like any kind of studies on carnivore and IQ, but I want to address, because you've said a lot, so there's a lot on the table I want to get through. So that's on the point about intelligence, which again I think we're in agreement. There is a link or correlation between higher IQ and vegetarianism. You're unsure about the causality. have never been proposing that it's vegetarianism leading to a higher IQ. You're a little bit skeptical about the concept of IQ. I don't think, that we see the same evidence with respect to carnivore diets, so I don't think the countercultural thing is explaining that as well. There's a pretty plausible path by which smarter people would say, okay, scientific evidence, as you said, tends to suggest that meat-free diets are healthier, certainly they're better for the environment, certainly that if you're at all tuned into the animal suffering component, then that's going to be a consideration as well. But I want to talk a bit about the broader health evidence and the criticisms there. On the healthy user bias, so, I know a lot of pro-meat people, as it were, are well versed in the criticisms of epidemiological studies. We do, in fact, have randomized control trials where people swap out meat consumption for alternatives. I think there's at least half a dozen at this point, studies where people are swapping out mainly red meat for plant-based meat alternatives, and do this for 8 or 12 weeks, and consistently they're showing decreased levels of LDL cholesterol, decreased BMI, decreased blood pressure, like all sorts of cardiometabolic health markers are improved when you reduce red meat consumption and swapping to plant-based meat alternatives, which are, oft demonized as ultra-processed foods, but in fact associated with improved health markers. And that is randomized controlled trial, so it's not, you don't have any of the kind of correlative or like healthy user bias and stuff like that. We do also see a dose-response relationship for, in particular, red and processed meat with a bunch of negative health outcomes. And so that means it's not just the people who are choosing to follow a vegetarian diet and they maybe have sort of other confounding things about being non-smokers and stuff like this, which could be a criticism, right? That they're interested in other healthy lifestyles. But then you also see a dose-response relationship. So it's not just the people who are avoiding it completely, but if you eat more of it, you're even more at risk of heart disease, cancer, early mortality. So again, that's pretty suggestive of a causal link. In the case of heart disease, is pretty well established as well through a study type called Mendelian randomization, which looks at genetic variation. Basically, some people are predisposed to have lower LDL cholesterol, and just like on a genetic basis. So that is, assigned at conception. It's not reflective of people's other choices. And people who are genetically predisposed to have lower LDL cholesterol are also at lower risk of cardiovascular health events. So it's pretty suggestive, again, that LDL cholesterol in particular, which is associated with red meat consumption, associated with saturated fat intake, is causally linked to heart disease. So there's a few things on the kind of criticisms that you've given of the evidence for, or the health evidence against red meat. I don't know if you want to say anything to that. Oh, and the only other thing they said is like opportunity for ideological bias, which I agree that opportunity certainly exists, but I would think, given that vegetarians and vegans are a large minority, if anything, it's tending to cut in the other direction. So most people coming to the research are motivated to not see bad things about diets, including meat, and to not see good things about diets that are meat-free. So to the extent that there is an ideological bias, I would suggest it tends to cut in the other direction. But yeah, we do have plenty of studies that.
With that.
Okay.
That seems almost absurd to me, really, to be honest with you. It's if you're a researcher in the human nutrition world, you're suggesting that there is cultural pressure within your field to not demonize meat. I mean, just go read the research that comes out of Harvard. I mean, it's very biased against overall, very biased against meat.
Well, it's not that it's biased against meat. It's that there's consistent findings of the research which are suggestive that we ought to be reducing consumption of red processed meat, right?
Well, no, I wouldn't necessarily agree with that. I think that those results are, less than compelling. You hear a lot about, differences in risk factors. You mentioned LDL cholesterol. But when we go look at the response in LDL cholesterol amongst certain subsets of people, we see a high variation in that response. So some people that adopt a higher meat diet, so most of the research has been on people that adopt a ketogenic, a meat-focused ketogenic diet. You see especially amongst people that are overweight or obese, which, let's face it, in most of the developed world is most of us, that there's a high amount of variation. There's a percentage of people who see a reduction in LDL cholesterol. There's a percentage of people that see a modest increase in LDL cholesterol. And then there's a small but significant minority that you might call hyper responders. Looks to me like somewhere between 10 and maybe 18% that can see dramatic increases in LDL cholesterol. And so, if the pattern there is meat is high in saturated fat, that leads to higher LDL cholesterol. Well, that is true in some people, and then that LDL cholesterol is a reliable marker for cardiovascular disease. Okay, well, first of all, a diet high in meat doesn't necessarily have to be high in saturated fat, as high in saturated fat. I mean, there's a big difference between a lean meat diet and a fatty meat diet. Now, I'm not necessarily advocating for one or the other, but the idea that saturated fat, the very high levels of saturated fat come along with a high meat diet, I don't think it's necessarily true.
Well, it's not necessarily true, but it's going to tend to be true, right? Particularly red meat, you're getting high saturated fats, you're going to end up with high LDL cholesterol, you're going to increase your chance of having heart disease.
There are plenty of cuts of pork that are, especially today, that are leaner than poultry. So, I mean, if you want to stay on a relatively low-fat diet and eat a substantial amount of meat, it's more than possible. So that's, in general, though, people that eat meat are going to eat a higher level of saturated fat. That's definitely true. And then the LDL cholesterol, I think a lot of the data is skewed by these hyper responders. And then there's some really interesting data out there as well, wondering maybe this is not a particular problem. It's very interesting that the people that tend to be hyper responders tend to be leaner and would be considered more fit than the people that have less negative or even positive response to an increased meat in their diets. I'm interested. I'm intrigued by some of that research. It's just not there yet. If I had a friend or a family member, or certainly if I was one of those hyper responders, I would be concerned about that. But there is some interesting, potentially compelling research that would claim that that's not necessarily a risk factor at the individual level. And I think that's a big part of what a problem with this discussion that we're having is we're trying to, if you're trying to say, okay, what's an nutritionally optimal diet for humans? Well, are we talking about at a population level, or are we talking about an individual level? Because I think the emerging research is there's a significant amount of variability. It might surprise you that I would be willing to concede that for a subset of the population, a vegan diet might be nutritionally optimal. I don't know if that's the case or not, but I would not be surprised to hear that. I would also not be surprised that for certain people that a carnivore diet or something very close to a carnivore diet might be nutritionally optimal. That's going to depend on genetic predispositions. It's going to, a lot of people with autoimmune diseases, for example, have seen, good results from a high, maybe not a carnivore, but a high meat diet. But my argument would be at the population level, probably most people's optimal diet would benefit from some inclusion of animal products, probably on a continuum. When we talk about individuals, I think it's a lot different. And so when you talk about that individual variation, if there's these hyper responders that are kind of, confusing the results in terms of LDL cholesterol, that becomes a bit of a problem. So if I'm looking at that at the population level, if all I know about a person is they started eating meat and they're eating more meat and their LDL cholesterol went up, if that's the only thing I know, I would probably say, yeah, you're probably at greater risk of cardiovascular disease. But if I was that person, I might take a different approach. I might say, okay, depending on what age I was and, what my current diet was and what other benefits I was, getting from that diet, I might, try to do imaging to see about the actual plaque. And, we've seen some of that. There's some evidence, and some of it is pretty anecdotal at this point, that there are people with very high LDL cholesterol levels that even over a period of time don't show any significant signs of plaque in their arteries. Are they at a higher risk of cardiovascular disease? Maybe, but maybe not. So there's a lot of variation. It becomes very difficult to make these broad statements, especially at the individual level, but even at the population level. And so if you think about, again, going back to that question, should people eat more meat or less meat? I think in developed countries where the main challenge is metabolic disorders and being overweight, I think it just depends on what you replace it with. I think most people, if they doubled their meat intake, would probably lose weight, right? So if you reduce your meat intake and replace that with green leafy vegetables and low sugar fruits, probably going to lose weight. Whatever you need to do to lose weight, if you're overweight, that's almost certainly the best thing that you can do nutritionally, at least in the short term. Now, if we look at developing countries, where the big challenge is nutrient deficiencies and caloric deficiencies, then adding meat to those diets can be very beneficial. So as a general rule, I would say those people probably need to eat more meat and animal products. But again, it becomes, and
let's stick to talking about developed countries, and we might have to go a little bit shorter back and forth. We come into the last 10 minutes and a lot of stuff still on the table. I think there is very, very strong evidence for LDL cholesterol being causally associated with heart disease, and I hear this talking point a lot. There's a consensus statement from people who study this saying the totality of evidence unequivocally establishes that LDL causes atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. The lean mass hyperresponders thing I've heard a couple of times as well. They did a trial in 2024, and they did coronary angiography, which like scans of the heart health, and they found significantly elevated coronary artery plaque among people in this category compared to control. So it was like the people. I'm talking about the people who coined the term lean mass hyperresponders. Did a study on this a couple of years ago, and they did still find increased levels of plaque in the coronary arteries. So it doesn't look like that is like the get out of jail free card on cholesterol that people sometimes think that it is. There is very, very good evidence that LDL cholesterol is causally associated with heart disease. It's going to be at increased levels for people who have meat in their diet, and certainly like red meat in particular. Yeah, I mean, the other thing I would want to see addressed, like there's a ton of evidence, ton of meta-analyses looking at hundreds of thousands, millions of people in some cases, showing associations with increased risk of heart disease, cancer, and early mortality in particular. And now you've said, this is, you're not that sold on observational studies, there's healthy user bias and stuff like this. And I said in the last, which I haven't had a response to, I don't know if you have anything to say to, there are RCTs which are associated with the variables that we would expect to lead to these conditions. So we do have some randomized control trials showing, again, like swapping out red meat for legumes, for nuts, for plant-based meat alternatives, you reduce those health risks. And then also there's the dose response point, which kind of like surpasses the healthy user bias, because you have not only people who are choosing not to eat meat having better health outcomes, but people who are eating even more meat having even worse health outcomes. So I think that kind of surpasses and envelops a lot of the would-be criticisms of the epidemiological data on this point.
Well, the randomized control trials that you're referring to are very short term. So I mean, you're making a huge leap if you extrapolate from one that gets, the twin study gets referred to a lot. I believe that was an 8-week study, and it was not isocaloric, right? So, what are those benefits and those markers? Was that from getting rid of meat or from eating more vegetables, or was it simply because you were calorically restricted? Yeah.
Well, there's been a few studies looking at it, and they replace meat directly with plant-based meat, right?
Yeah, and I'm not very familiar with those studies. I could go back and look at that. But
and if we accept anything about LDL cholesterol, like we're seeing a significant effect on LDL cholesterol, even in that short 8-week period, it probably ain't going to get better after a year of doing that kind of diet, right? Like you've cut down red meat, you've seen significant reduction in LDL cholesterol.
I don't think you can say that. I mean, we see that at all, and a lot in animal studies. We see a short-term transient benefit that proves not to endure, right? I think you start looking at some of these issues. It's stage of life. If you're at a certain stage of life, maybe there's more or less benefit. Maybe, but there's some emerging evidence that maybe a lower protein diet might be helpful in sort of that middle age, and then increasing that protein when you get to a more advanced age might make sense. So I think it's a lot. I think you're making some general assumptions that you can't really make, especially when you're talking about relatively small differences, and you're pretending as if there's no evidence to support the benefits of meat, which is certainly not the case. I mean, you look at there's some what was that 2019 study that showed an increased risk of hemorrhagic stroke, significantly increased. If you're going to call these other effects significant. I think it was a 20% relative increase in risk of stroke, overall stroke, most of that driven by hemorrhagic stroke, in people on a vegan. I can't remember if that was a vegan or vegetarian diet. I think it was vegetarian.
Right, but you'd agree that by the same standard, the weight of evidence, and we can talk about particular conditions like some higher risks on this diet, some on that diet, with the overall weight of this kind of evidence is increased overall mortality for increased meat consumption. Like vegans, vegetarians consistently have better health outcomes across, again, meta-analyses looking at cohorts and randomized control trials as well for the shorter term stuff, for hundreds of thousands, millions of people across different cohorts, across continents. Like, this is not at all contended on that level. If you want to talk about on the level of epidemiological evidence, it's very much decisive that there are better health outcomes for lower meat consumption.
Well, not in terms of hemorrhagic stroke.
Yeah, but why would you just care about one particular thing when I'm telling you the overall mortality is going to be worse?
Why would you not care about one particular thing?
Because presumably you care about not dying more than you care about not having a stroke.
I don't know if that's necessarily the case.
Why not? I'm talking about overall mortality, like your overall risk of death.
Would you want to spend the last 20 years of your life debilitated by stroke? I mean, I think you're drawing some broad conclusions there. Some outcomes are more concerning to some people than other, and I think
right. Well, if you care about not dying and not having heart disease and not having cancer, then for people who care about that kind of stuff, you should be eating less meat.
There was a study in 2022 that showed an increased risk of colorectal cancer in vegans. I mean, so there's does that mean that that was positive? I don't know. Probably
it's
not
about being causative, but it's about I mean, so look, again, we've got like the long-term epidemiological studies where you follow cohorts for years and years and years, and then you can say there's some complaints about that. It's observational. You have healthy user bias, blah blah blah. You have dose response things, which kind of gets past that to a decent extent, because that is going to be characteristic of a causal relationship, right? Where that's not to do with healthy bias, because if you have people who are eating meat and they have better health outcomes than people who are eating lots of meat, right? So I don't think that you can necessarily make the same case there. And then you also have shorter-term randomized control trials showing increases in the health markers that are associated with those health conditions, like increase in LDL cholesterol for people eating meat compared to plant-based meat, and then compelling evidence that LDL cholesterol increase is associated with increased causal risk of heart disease. I think the inference structure is pretty clear. There's worse health outcome. We haven't really spoken much about the cognitive health side either, which is kind of like one of the main things that we were going to discuss, but you see equally strong associations from, again, meta-analyses looking at dozens of different studies across like massive cohorts, hundreds of thousands, millions of people across many years, 26% lower risk of cognitive decline, 15% lower risk of dementia. There's like I'm looking at a bunch of meta-analyses that all consistently show in this direction for people following plant-based diets.
Yes, and those all would suffer from the healthy user bias. I mean, the reality is you're comparing, basically, for the most part, a relatively healthy vegan or vegetarian diet to a general population diet that includes meat. And that's a problem. Now, are there unhealthy
dose response relationship that if you're eating more meat, you're more likely to have a heart attack or cancer?
But that doesn't necessarily address the overall quality of the diet. And
only insofar as diets with more meat are of worse quality, which I guess I would agree with that.
Well, if you're saying that a vegetarian or vegan diet is more healthy because it includes higher levels of vegetables and fruits, I would say I generally agree with that. Okay, but nice. Whether that is superior compared to a diet that includes high levels of vegetables and fruits and also includes animal sourced foods, I think is very much not established. And
certainly suggested by the best health evidence that we have.
Well, I mean, you can say that if you want to, but these are very weak links, right? These are small effects. They're small effects. I mean, when you call out an 18% or 20% increase in relative risk, you're almost always describing relatively rare events. And so what you're seeing there
heart
is
disease and
really
cancer
an
are the
absolute
biggest
risk.
causes of death in developed countries.
Yes, but it's still on a your particular risk in the next 10 years or so is relatively small. I mean, usually for those types of things, you're talking about in terms of the general population, you're talking about, a 2% risk of, a 5% risk of. And so what you're talking about is increased risk of 2% to 3%, or an increase of 5% to 1%, and 18% relative risk or 20% relative risk sounds impressive, but in terms of absolute risk, it really isn't impressive. And you start thinking about all the potential confounders, and it gets really weak evidence. And you have some of these, there's several of these meta-analysis and reviews of systematic reviews of randomized control trials, which show null outcome, right? Global burden of disease study from 2022 basically said there was weak evidence linking meat to unprocessed red meat to adverse health outcomes.
Yeah, that also had the same conclusion about like passive smoking and chewing tobacco and stuff like that. That particular study uses a very weird star rating system where they basically exclude a lot of studies which are speaking to quite well established effects. And I think that's kind of speaking to something that is characteristic of this critique of epidemiology overall, because you're also not going to have any long-term randomized control trials showing that smoking causes lung cancer, for example. So often the trick is, and I don't mean to imply that you're being dishonest. I think you probably just read pro-meat sources talking about critiques of this kind of evidence, but it's insisting on a standard of evidence that basically can't exist with respect to randomized control trials over long term. You're not going to have people randomized to a diet follow for 10, 20, 30 years, or to randomize to smoking or not smoking to follow for that amount of time, right? So if you're waiting around for those studies to be published, you're going to be waiting forever. The best health evidence that we have, and maybe can have, is clearly indicative of increased risk of the largest causes of death in developed countries for increased meat consumption, and also of overall death as well, which is why we talk about overall mortality. Presumably that's the outcome that most people are ultimately concerned with.
Well, the comparison to secondhand smoking or chewing tobacco and meat is really absurd. There's no benefit.
That's the same conclusion from the global burden of disease study.
That's fine, but your conclusion can't be the same. There's no benefit to chewing tobacco, or there's no health benefits to chewing tobacco. There's no health benefits to secondhand smoke. There are health benefits to meat. It is a very high quality, highly bioavailable source of a wide variety of nutrients.
Right, but it's also consistently associated with worse actual health outcomes. Like all the stuff about bioavailability and nutrient density and other stuff of this nature. I don't know why anybody would care about that when there's looking at the actual human health outcomes evidence is consistently associated with worse health outcomes. So why do I care about bioavailability if it's also increasing my risk of heart disease, cancer, and early death? Like the outcomes is
universally increasing your risk. And like I said, it's just the quality of the evidence there is very weak. And there are a lot of confounders that we can't account for. And it's not as if there's no risk associated with a vegan diet. Rates of vitamin B12 deficiency are significantly higher amongst vegans than they are amongst meat eaters. There was a study in 2010 in the UK. I think it was males that showed that 52% of the vegans in the study were clinically deficient for vitamin B12. It was something like 7 or 8% in vegetarians, and basically, I think there was 1 out of like 280 omnivores where they were deficient in B12. Obviously, that's going to vary, right, based on supplement rates, but there was a study in 2013 that showed that vegetarian children and elder vegetarians were far more likely to have a vitamin B12 deficiency. I mean, the diet is fundamentally deficient.
Right, but you can take B12 deficiency. I have my B12 supplements right here. This is giving me 1,000% of my B12 requirement. I think these are about 10 cents per pill. Like, you can supplement B12 and just have better health outcomes. So I don't understand why supplementation is any kind of problem if it's associated with better health outcomes.
I don't have any problem with supplementation. I'm a lot of people are anti-supplement. I'm not anti-supplement. I think they have a wide variety of uses, but I think it is significant that you have a diet that's fundamentally deficient in an essential nutrient, and that you have to supplement in order to get that nutrient. I mean,
right, but why does that matter if there's also better health outcomes? Like, if you can have a diet where you take a supplement and have better health outcomes versus a diet where you don't take a supplement and have worse health outcomes, aren't you picking the diet with the better health outcomes?
Well, you're making broad generalizations. Okay, there's a wide variety of reasons why you might be at a higher health.
Vegans are associated with better health outcomes.
Well, what health? Hemorrhagic stroke?
Is that one that overall mortality?
Colorectal cancer. So there was a study that linked colorectal cancer with a vegan diet.
Colorectal cancer, like, definitely dose response relationships associated with higher increase of red and processed meat. Again, like, that same study has vegetarians and pescatarians at low, or I think pescatarians, but certainly vegetarians at lower risk of colorectal cancer. But in any case, the main point is the overall health outcomes. And we can get talking about certain nutrients and vitamins. We can talk about certain nutrients and vitamins. We look at overall health outcomes. We can look at certainly we can zoom in on like particular conditions and say, vegans have higher rates of whatever it may be, but overall mortality is going to be, the ultimate health outcome. And again, consistently, vegans associated with lower risk of overall mortality, and for heart disease and cancer, which are the leading cause of death in developed countries. So for me, that is like very difficult to surmount with any of these other concerns about like B12 deficiency or do you know what I mean? Like, it's just going to not be as important as health outcomes.
Yes, again, you're using these broad terms in terms of health outcomes.
Yeah.
And your risk of mortality is 100%. Right? It's so,
sure, but over a defined period, that is.
And people are free to, prioritize certain health outcomes. I have dementia and Alzheimer's disease in my family. And if there's something that I could,
don't be chonging the red meat, then, mate. Like, you're increasing your risk of getting those conditions.
If there's mixed data on that as well, there just is, and so you're
the weight of evidence I've seen is suggesting that if I had associated with high risk of dementia.
If I had to trade 1 year of life for a significant reduction in risk of dementia or Alzheimer's disease, I would do that in a heartbeat. So.
But you can get both of those. If you cut your red meat consumption, you get both of those benefits. You probably live longer and you'll be at lower risk of dementia or Alzheimer's. Yeah, absolutely.
That is not. It's not necessarily true. It's just not. Right?
This
data is confounded. It is it is, and here's another one, and I said I was an hour hard, but I really do have to go in a few
we're
minutes.
over time. That's fair.
But here's the other issue that I think really pollutes all of this data and really makes it really difficult. And that is there's this assumption that the people that get categorized as vegans and vegetarians in these studies are long-term vegans and vegetarians. And I look at the research and I'm not sure how many of those people actually exist. The recidivism rate for a vegan diet is extraordinarily high. 80%, 50% or more than 50% within a year. I think it was about a third of people quit the diet within 90 days. And so exactly what are we measuring here? And then you go look, and there's some of these surveys that show people that self-identified as vegans and vegetarians. I don't know if I have that. I don't think I have that handy, but it was something like 50% of them said that they had eaten meat or animal products in the last 24 hours. Okay, so what exactly is going on here? What exactly are we measuring? It looks to me like the evidence that there are very many long-term vegans, particularly, and even vegetarians that are compliant is pretty small. And so, what are we comparing? Are we, at best, maybe we're comparing a bunch of meat-eating vegans and vegetarians that presumably eat less because maybe they don't eat it in public. Maybe they just eat it in the shadows in a dark corner of a Walmart parking lot or something. I'm not sure exactly what I'm not sure exactly what to take from that, other than when I see a study about over 30 years, vegans and vegetarians have better health outcomes. How many of those people actually ate a vegan or vegetarian diet?
Well, I'm actually not going to contend that. We do survey research on this kind of topic, and that actually is a feature that we see. Like people's self-identification doesn't necessarily line up perfectly with their own. Again, like both are self-reported in this case, own self-reported consumption. But fortunately, like looking at the long-term health evidence, you do have both of those things. So you have both like dietary self-identity, self-categorization as vegan, vegetarian, or you put yourself in a category like that for the purpose of these studies, and then also food diaries, which are looking at what they are reporting to have consumed, and that's how you get the dose response thing, where people are, if you're eating even more red meat, then you're at an even higher risk of these negative health outcomes. So you do have both of those things going on.
Those diaries and questionnaires are notoriously unreliable. I mean, there's ways to do it that are more reliable. I mean, if you record it as you're eating, presumably, that's going to be more accurate. A lot of these studies ask you to, how much ham did you eat, last quarter of last year, and so,
it's
it's
usually
just
like
another reason.
It's usually a 7-day recall that they'll do. Like the most common one now is called Intake 24, that they'll do 3 days in a week, including 3 non-consecutive days in a week, including one weekend day, and they're asking about the prior 24 hours. So that's like the most common form at the moment. Now, again, like it's not going to be infallible, that kind of self-report.
Well,
but then again, you've got the randomized control trials where people are like given all of their food that they're going to eat. They literally box up, here's your food for the week, and this is all you're going to eat. And even in those cases, you're getting like the people who are swapping out meat, lower blood pressure, lower LDL cholesterol, they're losing weight. Like there's a variety of studies that have kind of different methods and ways of looking at this, and all of their conclusions are triangulating on the idea that the less meat that you're eating, the healthier that you're going to be in all of these different ways. But listen, I know you have to wrap up soon, so maybe we can both give like a bit of like a sort of 2-minute closing statement, and then we'll wrap it up.
Sure. You want me to go first?
Sure.
Yeah. So I think, my closing statement would be around, I think, for most people in most situations, the inclusion of some level of animal products in the diet is nutritionally optimal. I am unconvinced by the data on either negative effects on mental health for a vegan diet, or the cognitive benefits of a vegan diet for not necessarily just reserving judgment, because I just don't think the quality of evidence is sufficient in those areas. When it comes to health, I think the results are mixed. I think the healthy user bias is a giant problem. I think the inability to conduct long-term randomized control trials is a real problem. I think ideological bias is a huge problem. I think the methodology in terms of collecting the data is a huge problem, and this is not necessarily a criticism of the researchers. I feel for them. It's an enormous challenge to try to collect good quality data. I think this is just one of those areas where you're not going to have the type of conclusive data that we'd all like to have to be able to make a decision. And I think you've got to take the totality of the evidence, positive and negative, and make a decision on what's right for you. And I think ultimately that's really what this comes down to, is there's just so much variation. I've seen this in the animal studies that we do, and you're starting to see some of this in some of the human research that shows there's just a very wide variety of nutritional needs. And so when we start to try to make policy decisions, we're doing that on the average. And I think what we've seen is there's probably more variation than what we thought, not less variation. And so I think as you try to draw big conclusions from the data, I think it's very difficult, very challenging. And I think everybody's ultimately got to decide, take a look at the data. Unfortunately, most people are going to have to depend on people to interpret the data for them. And that's unfortunate, but it's not realistic to expect everybody to be able to keep up and interpret the data. And that's just not terribly reasonable. And so what I think I would like to see is a recognition that there are different benefits of different diets for different people. And I think there should be a wide range of available options out there. I think a vegan diet for a certain subset of people is, with supplementation, is safe and can be healthy. I think that's probably true for the carnivore diet, and I think that's certainly true for everything in between. And so that's my take. I think it's supported by the evidence. I think it's balanced, and it may not be a satisfactory answer because people want clear answers, but I just don't think the data supports the ability to make broad conclusions. And so if that's unsatisfying, I'm sorry, but I just think that's the reality of the situation that we find ourselves in. And we just have to understand the limitations of the research and make the best decision that we can with for ourselves, with the consultation of our doctor and any other professionals that you want to bring in.
All right, well, thanks for the closing statement. I'll just give a few words as well. I appreciate that you've run a bit over time here, so, thanks for doing that. I agree with some of what's been said there. I think that it's not reasonable to expect everyday people to be able to interpret evidence on health and nutrition, which can be complicated. That said, the overwhelming weight of the evidence that we have and the expert interpretation of that evidence is supportive of the view that plant-based diets are going to be healthier, that in particular red and processed meats are associated with increased risk of cancer, heart disease, and mortality. We've heard a bit about the healthy user bias in epidemiological studies, but we have not heard any rebuttal to the ways that can be overcome, like looking at dose-response relationships, looking at randomized control trials in the short term, and also looking at Mendelian randomization trials for people who are predisposed to have low LDL cholesterol, for example. All of these three are ways that we can make conclusions about the health data that we have, which overcomes that healthy user bias. So we have agreed that there's a link between higher IQ and vegetarianism. We had got into the details about that relationship to some extent, but I think we're in agreement that that generally is the case. We've also agreed that people in developed countries who are looking to eat more healthy plant foods will likely be benefiting their health to be eating less meat. That is the mainstream scientific health and nutrition position, and that, yeah, most people...
You misspoke there. I think you meant developed countries, and I think you said developing countries.
Pardon me, in developed... Thank you for that, yeah. Pardon me, in developed countries, if you're living in a developed country and you are looking to improve your overall health, then reducing meat is going to be a way that you can do that. So we'll leave it there. Thanks for coming on, Todd. I appreciate the conversation.
Sounds good.
All right. Take care.
Thanks a lot.